I am King County Council Member Larry Gossett, and it gives me a great deal of privilege and honor to host our great Martin Luther King celebration sponsored by my office and the Equity and Social Justice team here in Martin Luther King Jr. County. I told our very special guest speaker, Bill Fletcher, that this is the only geographic jurisdiction in the world community named in honor of Dr. King, and we are very proud of that fact. But to get our, and as county employees, I wanted to thank all of you, though, for coming down and sharing in this part of our effort to make people more conscious, aware, and inspired by the work of our great namesake, Martin Luther King Jr. But I'd like to get us started by asking Michael Hepburn to provide some music and a great appropriate song for us in the great tradition of the Black community. Actually, his whole life is reflective of that. He started playing the piano and singing at the ripe old age of 6. And the brother's from Portland, Oregon. He works in the civil division as a lawyer in our, in Dan Satterberg's office right now. But he has this special talent that he has agreed to share with all of us. And at many of our MLK events in the past, he has either moderated, sung a song, or played the piano, or just kept all the rest of us in line. So he's experienced. But he started playing and singing at 6 in Portland as part of the Zion Hill Church of God in Christ. So without further ado, I'd like to present to all of you our colleague, Mr. Michael Hepburn.
How's everybody doing? How's everybody? Wonderful. It's so great. Such an honor for me to be able to be a part of the commemoration of 50 years since the assassination of Dr. King. I chose this song because I do think it's appropriate. It's by Donny Hathaway. It's called Someday We'll All Be Free. Thank you, Council Member Gossett, for putting this on. This is wonderful. It's a great privilege for me. Hang on to the world as it spins around. Just don't let the spin get you down. Though it's moving fast, hold on tight and you will last. Keep your self-respect, be dignified. Get yourself in gear, keep your stride. Never mind your fears. Brighter days will soon be here. Take it from me, someday we'll all be free. How many people remember this song? There, I see some hands. All right. You know where I'm coming from. Keep on walking tall. Hold your head up high. Lift your dreams right up to the sky. Sing your greatest song, and you'll keep going, going on. Keep your self-respect, be dignified. Get yourself in gear. Keep your stride. Never mind your fears. Brighter days will soon be here. Just wait and see. Someday we'll all be free. Whoa, just wait and see. Someday we'll all be free. Yeah, take it from me. Someday we'll all be free. Whoa, just wait and see. Someday we'll all be free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And we're going to bring the brother back up at the end as we do a rendition of We Shall Overcome when we're closing out. I mentioned a little earlier that my office is not the only entity of our government sponsoring this event. We're being sponsored by the Equity and Social Justice Committee of the legislative branch. And I'm really happy that we're able to do this. And right now, though, I would like to have you all recognize that one of my, and I'm looking around, make sure I'm not leaving anybody else out. My colleague, Jeannie Cole Wells, is in the house with us celebrating, so we're really happy that you're here. Jeannie Cole Wells. And I'd like for you all to be my eyes if you see other members of the county council or the county executive join us. But the reason in introducing Bill, started off the way that I did, I don't know how many of you will recall that in 2006, the King County Council adopted a strategic plan for the county's equity and social justice activities, where not only have we said that we will take equity and social justice into consideration in everything that we do in our government, we will try and taking it into consideration to do something about it. So if we're talking about reducing mass incarceration or disproportionality in the King County criminal justice system, then we, the county council, are going to try to figure out ways in holding all of you accountable to suggest things that we think ought to be done to reduce the number of blacks and other people of color and low-income people who are not who are being incarcerated, but we certainly think that we could find alternatives to incarceration when you're primarily in there because you're poor, have nowhere to stay, are mentally ill, or drug or alcohol dependent, and you need health care, not jail care. And we want to do something about that. Let's give it up. So when we wrote that, though, we said that in relationship to our goals as a county, we will be conducting activities and providing training that will be available to legislative branch and other employees of the county government. And it's within this context that we were very happy that we were able to reach out to Bill Fletcher and have him come and participate in our Martin Luther King Jr. celebration efforts here in Martin Luther King Jr. County. Mr. Fletcher is the former president of Trans-Africa Forum, and he's a senior scholar with the Institute of Policy Studies. That's an editorial board, and he's also an editorial board member of a national group called Black Commentators. And he's been on TV, he's written many articles, he's written many books that I know several of you are very aware of, but I'll just mention a few of them, because if I mentioned all of them, I would take up all his time, and Cindy Domingo and him wouldn't like that. But Bill Fletcher co-authored a book with Peter Agard. Did I pronounce? Agard, thank you, called The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1941. Most of us, when we hear about the AFL-CIO, we don't know that any blacks were involved. And in fact, if you read that book, you'll find that black workers were an integral part, just like they were in the, going all the way back to the Civil War. Nothing in our history suggests that 184,000 black soldiers fought on the Union side in the last couple of years of the war, and they were pivotal in our nation winning that conflict. So what I would like to do is just mention, I don't even know if Bill knows this, I know that he has a book coming out, a new book coming out that I want to draw y'all's attention to. It's called The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And I told him he's kind of like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is one of the more famous and well-known black writers in our country today, who went from writing really critical essays and books in Atlantic about the black experience in America now to doing the comic book Black Panther, that is now one of the world's greatest and most successful films, having made about $400 million during its first 3 weeks out in the market. And I'm not saying Bill's book is going to sell that many copies when it comes out, but it's a murder mystery. It's not about the civil rights, human rights, labor movement, but it does show the creativeness of the way his mind thinks and works. He's had a profound impact on the movement for equity and social justice in this country. So without further ado, I present to all of you Mr. Bill Fletcher.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am very honored to be here. I want to thank Councilmember Gossett, my friend Cindy Domingo. I want to thank all of you for being here with me. Yes, my book will be coming out in September, And when it becomes a film and makes $400 million, I will send out personal invitations to all of you. I want us to give our singer another round of applause. It's fate because that song was sung at my wedding. And that song always meant a lot to me. And then discovering it was going to be sung today, that wasn't planned, you know, and I appreciate it. I want to talk today about what I'm calling the forgotten king. Because over the years, I've become increasingly angry, sometimes furious, usually around January 15th, sometimes around April 4th, when there are these clips of King. And usually the same clip from the '63 March on Washington, usually the same moment, which is when he's saying at the end of the speech about having a dream. And at a certain point, you realize that this is actually a very small segment of who King was. And you start to ask, well, is it therefore surprising that particularly younger people have no sense of King, and many older people have forgotten who King was? And what's important for us to understand is that this is not unusual. That upon the death of great people, almost immediately there is a struggle that ensues. And it's a struggle over how their legacy is to be interpreted and popularized. It happens almost immediately. It happened in my lifetime when Malcolm was killed. It happened when King was killed. You see it over and again, almost immediately. And the ruling elite always attempts to take the figures of the oppressed and make them acceptable, up to and including putting them on postage stamps. And I'm not joking. They attempt to make this figure someone who is acceptable and becomes the mouthpiece, even deceased, but becomes the mouthpiece for the messages that the ruling elite wishes to convey. It happens all the time. It's not new. And it happened in a case with King. And it's interesting the way that it happens, because it's subtle, sometimes blatant, but usually subtle. And it's done through a rewriting of history and a whiting out, no pun intended, of those elements of the person's life and history that don't quite fit into the larger narrative that the rulers wish to perpetrate. There's some figures in history that the ruling strata of the United States has found it virtually impossible to do that to, because their existence was in complete and total contradiction to any part of the narrative. And one case in point is John Brown, who U.S. history has been unable to define. They can't figure out, how do you classify a white man who was prepared to pick up guns and take out the slave owners and incite a slave insurrection, and not doing that as some great savior, but as a comrade of the slaves? How do you do that? And U.S. history can't quite figure out what to do with it. So it's just much easier to just shove it under the rug. With King, they could not shove him under the rug, but they had to redefine him. And then what helps that is a tendency that all too many of us have, where we want our leaders to be pure. We want them to be perfect. And we also want to believe that there's a straight trajectory in their thinking, that where they ended up was the logical place from where they began, and there was no zigzagging. And I just want to give you an example before I get into the issue of King to talk about this, because it becomes a real problem. It has nothing to do with King, it had to do with Malcolm X. I was inspired. I'm a child of Malcolm X. Malcolm X was the star for me. After reading his autobiography, that my life changed fundamentally. And I moved in a certain direction. In reading the autobiography and other things that were written, I came to believe that when Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam, there was pretty much a straight line to his death on February 21st, 1965. So back in the 1980s, I happened to be helping someone with an oral history project. And it was about black folks that worked on the railroads. And I interviewed the chef in Boston who had been a friend of Malcolm X's. The guy at that point owned a restaurant, and they had worked together on the railroads. And so we're chatting, and then at some point he told me that after Malcolm had left the Nation of Islam, he at some point came back to Boston and privately was talking with the chef and was expressing all kinds of misgivings and was asking the chef, should he return to the Nation of Islam? Had he made a mistake? Well, my Lord, I was ready to take one of the chef's knives and cut him up. How dare he suggest that my hero had any doubts? How dare he suggest that there was any question in the direction that Malcolm was going? And I realized at that point the dangerous nature of thinking about our heroes as if they're not human beings. And that's precisely what many of us have allowed to happen in the case of King. So it's not simply that the rulers have construed him, but many of us want to believe that he was somehow above humanity. And see, here's the problem with that. The problem is that once you discover that they are actually human, once you discover that they've made mistakes, that they've not been something perfect, frequently many of us lose hope. Many of us start despairing. Many of us feel betrayed. And it's only because we've betrayed ourselves, because we believed that these individuals were somehow beyond what humans are. So I want to identify 4 elements of what I would say are part of the forgotten king. The first part flows from the last thing I said. King was not a saint. He was a human being. And he was a human being who apparently had an incredible sense of humor. He loved to play around and joke with his friends. He was apparently very accessible. He made mistakes. He apparently had affairs. He also was deeply in love with his wife and loved his children. So he was not a saint. He was a complex human being, but he was a complex human being who made certain decisions. He made a decision to engage in a kind of activity where he knew, and certainly the night before he was killed, he knew he was going to die. He knew that there was a chance of death. He knew that he was not going to become wealthy pursuing this course of action. That didn't make him a saint. It made him, however, an exceptional human being. And he actually, when you look at him and realize he wasn't a saint, you realize that he and his legacy can be emulated. That any of us can follow that path. That while he was exceptional, each of us can learn in lessons from his life and become just as exceptional. Maybe not in the same way, but pretty much. But when we put him up on some sort of cloud and take him away from humanity, then it is actually impossible to emulate his life. Because after all, who emulates a saint? The second thing, King was an evolving thinker and leader. It goes back to this issue that I was raising about trajectory. I mean, you had a person who was a pastor, a mediator. He was a very interesting leader, and his leadership style is something that should be studied a great deal more. Because one of the things about King as an evolving leader was that he did not fear having bright lights around him. I don't mean focused on him. I mean, he did not have problems with having brilliant people in his circle. He was not threatened by that. And I want you to think about that for a second and contrast that with many of the leaders that we know, who, when they are surrounded by exceptional people, they chase them away. They fire them. In some cases, they kill them, right? But they have to be the ones whose light shines. No one else can. But in King's case, what's fascinating when you look at it, if you look at his inner circle, all of his inner circle were exceptional leaders in their own right. All of them. And the fact that King embraced them and encouraged them to speak their minds, even when they disagreed with King, built a level of loyalty that I have not seen with most leaders. Most leaders are so insecure, they're always afraid that their second in command or someone else is going to come after them with a knife. King had no worry about that. He was able to build a kind of loyalty within that group where people were ready to fall on their swords for him. And I think that there's much to be learned from that. Also, as part of this, King was a troublemaker. And you see, I'm using that term very explicitly because the white supremacists always said he was a troublemaker. And they were right. They actually were right. He was. And why was he? Well, let me say why I'm saying this. One is that when you watch these repeated ads, and in the various documentaries about King, you don't necessarily get the understanding. This man was about breaking the law. He was about creating mischief. He was about stirring things up. He had absolutely no problem with that. He understood that when there is an immoral law, you break it. Right? You don't excuse it away. He was growing up and fighting Jim Crow segregation. Jim Crow segregation was the law. By defying Jim Crow segregation, he was in fact stirring up trouble. And what the white supremacists in the South and those that didn't wear sheets in the North were always afraid of was challenging the way that system was operating. And any time that a person of color, or for that matter, a white person, stood up against white supremacy, they were always deemed troublemakers. And King was, in fact, a troublemaker. If you look at what happened in the Birmingham demonstrations in 1963, it was brilliant thinking about making sure that these demonstrations were covered on television. Now, today, that may seem like to most of us. Right? But in 1963, that kind of coverage was revolutionary because people saw Bull Connor's people. They'd see these white supremacists attacking these kids. And it was not just like reading something in the newspaper. King understood this. This was stirring up trouble. Right? And so this was another key element of who King was. Another piece was that, and it was a piece that I did not appreciate at my young age. I became radicalized when I was 13 and identified very quickly with Malcolm X and with the Black Panther Party and others. And I sort of poo-pooed a lot of the message of King, but I did not appreciate that King was in fact a nonviolent revolutionary, with an emphasis on the revolutionary, that his notions were not simply about civil rights. But when you read his speeches and you look at what was happening, particularly in the last 2 years of his life, which I'll get to in a second, you see that he had a vision for a social transformation of the United States. It wasn't just about adding one reform on top of another. It was about social transformation. And it was interesting because at the same time, there were many militant Black power advocates who moved in a very different direction. They moved in a very pro-capitalist direction, mainstream direction, And you thought initially that they were to the left of King, but it turned out that they actually were not. That King's views were, in fact, very revolutionary, and the kind of country that he was talking about needing to come into existence necessitated the type of alliances that he was set to create and worked on for the final 2 years of his life. The third element, King was a labor leader. Now, most of the trade union movement, and I didn't say a trade union leader, he was a labor leader. He was a leader of working class people. Most trade unionists and trade union leaders did not and do not look at King as a labor leader. They see him or project him as having been a civil rights leader. Now, part of that is the way that we silo people. Part of it is that it's much easier to always put black folks in a certain category where we're concerned with race and civil rights. We can't possibly be concerned about anything else. And when we speak out on anything else, we're overstepping our bounds. More about that later. King was, in fact, a labor leader. So beginning early in his career, one of the things that he appreciated was the significance of the trade union movement. And one of the battles that he undertook, which Michael Honey in a number of his books has addressed, was to try to get the trade union movement, dominated by whites, to understand that its future lay in an alliance with African Americans and other people of color. And that African Americans needed the support of the trade union movement to advance our overall objective. King understood this, and if you read his speeches, beginning in the 1950s, you'll see this basic theme repeated again and again and again. But it wasn't just about the trade unions. What King also appreciated as a labor leader was the broader struggle for social justice. And therefore, in 1967, when he starts to talk about and formulate the notion of the Poor People's Campaign, this was not just an idea that he had because he had run out of steam with so-called civil rights. It wasn't just something he was bouncing into. He understood, and he made it clear, but again, this is one of the things that we don't see in much of the history, that the logical continuation of the civil rights struggle was fusing it with the economic rights struggle. And that necessitated building a broad alliance, what he called the Poor People's Campaign. This was, again, all related to the notion of a social transformation of the United States. And so in that sense, King saw himself, or actually was, a leader of working people, but he was doing it in a way that infused the struggle against racism. And I emphasize this because there are those that believe that we can and should carry out a struggle for economic justice and not mention race, not mention gender. We should just talk about strict economics and that will unite us. That was not King's approach. King understood and was very, very clear about the importance that race played in the construction of the United States, that you can't avoid it. You can't run around. There is no silver bullet that allows us to avoid dealing with race. If you're going to deal with injustice, you're going to deal with race. But it wasn't enough to deal with race because ultimately you've got to deal with capitalism. The fourth point, King was a global justice leader. You know, on April 4th, 1967, he gave his famous speech at Riverside Church in New York against the Vietnam War. Many people do not realize that that wasn't the first time he had spoken out against the Vietnam War. He had been speaking out quietly, but increasingly, beginning at least in '65. And for King, this was quite a logical progression. The response, however, was something that many people wish to deny today. It was a logical progression because what he understood was that you can't have a battle for human rights in the United States while the United States is committing acts of aggression overseas, what it was doing in Vietnam. It wasn't simply about the resources that were going into the war that could be used in the United States, but it was his recognition that the war was fundamentally immoral. as he said, the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet, a point that W.B. Du Bois had made some years prior. The United States, the greatest purveyor. Can you imagine in a post 9/11 environment, when people say something like that, what you're called? And so, but King was prepared to step out there and say that the struggles that we engage in here for democracy and justice will only succeed to the extent that we also challenge immoral, aggressive policies by our government overseas. Now, the response he received to that was absolutely amazing, and there's very little discussion about this in mainstream history. The mainstream press jumped on him like white on rice. They came after him and called him everything but a child of God. They denounced him. They talked about how literally he should not be speaking about things that he didn't know about. They were saying that this was wrong, that he was derailing the mission of the civil rights movement. Some of his key allies backed away from him. He became a very lonely man for the last year of his life, because many of the people that he had been fighting alongside with were not prepared to walk that extra mile with him in challenging U.S. foreign policy. They were prepared to sit back and to be silent while the Vietnamese were being massacred. They believed that we could have some sort of peace and justice in our time in this country and allow the Vietnamese to be destroyed. But King was not. And he was denounced. And he was denounced until his death. It's not that this was a temporary denunciation. The mainstream media, I believe it was the Boston Globe, that said in one of their editorials that he had no business speaking up about the Vietnam War. So there was this breadth to him. Now, it's interesting in raising this, that when you think about King memorials that take place every January 15th, how often does anyone remember hearing any element of his 67 speech? What references to the 67 speech, to his position on the Vietnam War? None. Right? There's always the same 1963 clip. And again, as a result, people don't realize that King was what he was. So let me pull all of these together. When we're looking at King, we have to always understand that we are in a constant battle over history and legacy that never lets up. It was one of the mistakes of my generation that many of us that were active thought that when you won something, you actually had won it, and that there was no going back. Yes. Right? We thought that the end of Jim Crow meant that the opportunities were open, that freedom was just around the bend. Right? We expected that there would be greater resources put into housing, education, etc. We did not think that things could, in fact, go backwards. We thought that with the death of King, that his militancy, his oratory, his challenging of power, that would not be forgotten. And we were wrong. We were wrong across the board, because those things are forgotten. And this is one of the reasons that organization becomes so important. Organization is the bridge between generations. And what we have to always appreciate is that when new generations emerge, the history is often forgotten. It needs to be told over and again. You can't expect that someone else is going to do it for you. And our greatest mistake was believing that someone else would tell the story of King, when the story of King is actually not a story that those in positions of power, those in positions of wealth, have much of an interest in recounting. They want a safer king. They want a king that embraces their messages. They don't want the king that lived. They don't want our king. Thank you very much.
for, thank you. Thank you. For those of you who can stay a few minutes, Mr. Fletcher is going to respond to some questions that you have, but I'd like to call Cindy Domingo up here to kind of organize that questioning and give some leadership to it. But I want to read, just to reinforce what Brother Fletcher said about Dr. King's and his real self being forgotten. I'd like to just read a quote from a letter that he wrote his wife. It's a political and not a political quote. And I need Cindy to come up here and start. Oh, here it is it's on the jacket. This is a book put together by Cornel West, the great black contemporary intellectual. This is a letter to Coretta Scott before King married her. He said, "Dear, I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Capitalism started out with a noble and high motive, but like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against." And he later said similar things about socialism, that a lot of what we see today, they are not taking into consideration the morality and the individuality of human beings, and that needs to be criticized. So his constant effort, his last year of his life, to tie racism, poverty, and militarism together was definitely part of his philosophy. Cindy Domingo.
Open it up if anybody had any questions for Bill or wanted to raise any points on their own.
I just want to say thank you so much, and thank you for all the work that you're doing and continue to do. And also, I'd like to thank my dear friend, Larry Gossett. You are just awesome, and we really appreciate your leadership in our community, and we just appreciate you. Could you tell me what was the third point?
Sure. I'll just run through each of them. The first was that King was not a saint. The second was that King was an evolving thinker and leader. The third was that King was a labor leader. And the fourth was that King was a global justice leader.
It was just like my dad used to say a thing, honey, all you got to do is die for him. And is it our human brain that once you die and everything, you get all your recognition? And how can we appreciate all of us when we're living? How can you give me some pointers?
You know, I feel like I met my soulmate just now. Because I ask myself that regularly. You know, it's like people get remembered when they're dead. There's no use at that point for that person. And one of the things about that is that, and you see this when you look at the life of King, when you look at the life of Malcolm, others, how difficult their lives were, the stresses and strains on them, the sense that of frequently feeling that no one really cared, that no one was there for them when they had problems. And because it's not like King didn't have problems. But who was he going to talk to? Who was going to acknowledge and say, Dr. King, you don't know how much you mean to us. And I would say that the fault lies with most of our institutions, religious as well as secular, that we, when we honor people frequently who, this will sound terrible, they get honored all the time. we frequently don't honor the people that are ignored. I remember in Boston, there were these, the Boston Rainbow Coalition used to have these annual banquets. They were great. And they would honor people. And every year, I used to submit the name of a guy named James Garrett. And James Garrett was a black iron worker who had led a struggle to desegregate the Ironworkers Union. James Garrett was not a noted figure. He was a regular guy who liked big hats. And he put his life on the line. But he never got honored. You know, they'd honor, you know, with all due respect, Councilman such and such, you know, Senator such and such, Reverend such and such, Doctor such and such, right? But when it came to like regular people who put their life, no, right? And I hold organizations responsible for that. There's a level of elitism that we have. And then when people, and then the other thing that happens is people may get honored when they're terminally ill, right? It's like all of a sudden when someone's terminally ill, they're going to die in 2 months, or they just got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, then all of a sudden everybody shows up to say, oh, wow, you know, you don't know how much we appreciate it. But what about saying that when the person was alive and well? When they needed that extra, and I'm saying this, I'm not trying to be funny, because one of the things that kills us is stress. One of the things that affects our mental stability is stress and feeling alone and feeling isolated. And when you know you have the support of your community, you can go forward. But when you feel like you're on your own, it takes a major toll. So I think it's our institution, sister.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. I join others in appreciating you coming and speaking.
Thank you.
Human nature wants pleasure, absence of want. But one of the lessons of life is that there's going to be challenges. And the things you talked about today, about Dr. King, tells me that there really is no respite. The struggle for social justice, economic justice, will continue, just the way humans are.
That's right.
Yes.
And the earliest we can learn that lesson, that we cannot stop the struggle, that it's okay to take a break and enjoy each other, have a festival, and have some drink. But you got to get up the next day,
That's right.
knowing that the economic and racial history, not just the United States, but the world. We have an opportunity in the United States with our diversity, which is increasing, to really dampen the effects of injustice. And I think the lesson for younger generations, and the kids from Florida are showing us what can happen when they act on their moral core of what is right and what is wrong.
That's right.
And so I'd like to have you make some comments about my comments.
And I will. And how much time do we have? Okay, because I saw a question over there and a few others, so I want to make sure to get them. There's this law in nature, entropy, that things fall apart. Unless there is a countervailing force, things fall apart. Metals rust, concrete crumbles, things fall apart. The same is true with societies, that unless you actively fight against disintegration, disintegration will happen. And one of the greatest mistakes we have that parallels this problem of the way we look at heroes, is thinking that society has itself been this straight improvement, and not recognizing that at different points, societies have collapsed into chaos, in some cases never fully recovering. So that's one of the reasons that we can't rest easy. That relates to what you were just saying. We can't rest easy. This is a constant struggle. I think this is the fate that the Creator of all things put before us. I don't think that I think, as you said, you can rest, you can take a vacation, but you can never think that you've achieved the final victory. Because with humans, I don't think that there is one. I think it is to eternity.
Carolyn. Wait, no. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Bill, and thank you, Larry.
please?
I just said thank you very much, Bill, and thank you, Larry, for inviting and calling for this gathering to honor Dr. Martin Luther King. I wanted to say first that Dr. Martin Luther King did not ask anybody to honor him. He asked us to honor ourselves. And to honor ourselves is to keep the torch and to continue the work that he has been doing. And he has sacrificed for his life. I think I want to say that because it is very important. You spoke about troublemaking. I like that. I really do, because if there is no disturbance, if there is no wind, there is no mixture. I wouldn't come here at this court or at this place or in King County, the most beautiful city in the world, Seattle, had it not been the trouble that is existing, that has negative on one side, negativity and positivity on the other side, which is mixing the people. It's beautiful. And God has his intentions somehow that I don't know and I cannot explain. Isn't it the mixing that the wind blows through the oceans and the seas to cool the earth? The trouble that this wind is making is what cools us and gives us the oxygen and the breathing and this blessing that we have. So I think he was right to the point for the work that he has done. And personally, I'm committed to continue from my end. I have broken the barriers of fear. I'm not afraid. There's no need. I know it's up to us. I did not stand to ask questions, but I was very emotional by coming here and sharing that with you all. And I was not even expecting that I would have an opportunity. But thank you so much.
Martin Luther King is one of my heroes, and of all my heroes, I love the most probably is their humanness, the mistakes they make, the jokes they tell, and I was very intrigued by the fact that you said that he had this wonderful sense of humor, because I knew about the mistakes and I loved him more for it. But I didn't know about the humor, and so I'm wondering what sources would I go to read some about that?
He had a pillow fight right before he was killed. He and his crew, they just started messing with each other, and in the hotel, and they had a pillow fight. people don't unfortunately write about this stuff much. You pick it up through oral interviews, oral histories. And I was moved, actually, when I first heard that about the pillow fight. It's like all of a sudden he became a different person. He wasn't any longer on Mount Olympus. He was like someone I would have known. And I think it's incredibly important for us to appreciate that in the leaders that we deal with. It's also important because we have to humble them. I know I shouldn't say that, it might upset some people, but leaders have to be humbled. They have to remember that they are themselves not demigods. And they need us to every so often have that little pin that bursts the bubble that's around them and says, come on back down to earth, bud. And that was one of the reasons that the pillow fight struck me, right? Because there's certain people that I know and I've worked for, I could never imagine having a pillow fight with them, right? But the fact that he and his comrades were around and they could engage in that level of joking, that told me an amazing amount about his leadership style. And it's something that I've actually tried to emulate, not the pillow fights, but.
Okay, we're going to have two more comments, and then we want to make sure we have a time for Michael's last song.
We don't need time for my last
Oh,
song.
no, we do.
I'm having a good time. I cannot believe the competence in this room. It is so wonderful to hear so many incredible insights and questions. This is fantastic. Please, whoever was called.
Thank you for that speech. It was very insightful. So you mentioned about Malcolm X, who was fighting against the same injustice and was fighting for the same cause, but he had a different approach compared to Dr. King. Some of them may argue in present day that Malcolm X was more of a realistic compared to Dr. King. Do you think if the unfortunate events didn't happen, if Malcolm X and Dr. King weren't assassinated, they would have found a common ground to solve this civil injustice?
Absolutely.
And my second question, I have two questions, sorry. You mentioned about how the legacy of these people are misrepresented.
Yeah.
And one of my heroes is Bobby Kennedy. And I feel like he has been underappreciated. Mm-hmm. What do you think with with whatever is happening now, with whatever technologies we have, how can we avoid this from happening, and how can we avoid falling for the lies and the misrepresentation of someone's life or cause?
Let me try to give a quick response. So first of all, I think that King and Malcolm would have attempted to work together. They were different. Malcolm was not a good organizer. King was actually a brilliant one. Malcolm was a tremendous orator and inspiration. And in saying he wasn't a good organizer, not a criticism, because when he was in the Nation of Islam, he had around him some people who were good organizers. And so Malcolm was able to raise the rabble, and then there were people that could build it. A. Philip Randolph had the same type of thing with a guy named Milton P. Webster. A. Philip Randolph from the Brothers of the Sleeping Car Porters, he could speak like a Shakespearean, right? And was very visionary. Milton P. Webster is the one who built the Brothers of the Sleeping Car Porters, worked every day thinking about the organization. So King and Malcolm were quite different, but there was real possibilities, I think, which the other side didn't want to have happen. The issue of not allowing a repetition of this has nothing to do with technology. It has to do with organization. It's the reason that the other side, when I'm saying the other side, I mean the rich and infamous, are always set on destroying our organizations. Using things like COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program that led to the assassination, jailings, rumor mongering, everything. The other side understands the importance of organization. And they understand that that's the vehicle that we, the oppressed, have. That if they can destroy organization, they can destroy us. And when you destroy organization, you then destroy history, because there's no way of conveying it. When I was a young radical, I remember being so proud that my generation had invented the red, black, and green Black liberation flags. I mean, I just said, wow, this is great, until I realized it wasn't my generation that did it. It had started under Garvey in the 20s, right? But I didn't know this. That legacy was destroyed. It was ripped away, partly during the Cold War. It was just ripped away, so that we ended up like reinventing things, or you'd get elements of it, almost like out of a science fiction novel, where you're getting elements from a destroyed civilization. And so it's about organization. Organizations are easy to form and easy to end. They're very hard to sustain. But it's sustaining organization that will mark whether we win or not. Because it's not going to be on the basis of money. I've done this poll around the country, and you can participate in it now too. The poll is a very simple question. Can anyone think of a time when the oppressed had more money than the oppressor? Let's just a show of hands, and don't be shy, right? It ain't gonna happen. So stop whining about it. Organization is what will kick the rear of the other side. It preserves our history and makes it possible for us to win.
Check.
Well, you had mentioned that the ruling elite tends to try to change the persona of our revolutionaries. I think the league mentioned John Brown.
Oh, yeah.
And Nat Turner, and Malcolm to lead some others. But how do we really go? Do you believe that the ruling elite wants to change the persona, or doesn't know how to be able to explain what they were thinking, or do you think that they don't want to recognize them at all?
So a little bit about all of that. Sometimes they don't want to recognize them at all. So sometimes there's an attempt to just simply remove individuals from history, so that you have to really search to find these people, right? In other cases, it is an attempt to change their legacy in a way that all of a sudden they become different, right? So both of those are going on. That is why we have to be engaged in a struggle, an ideological struggle, and a struggle around history. It's why Du Bois wrote the brilliant Black Reconstruction in America. Right?
My second question was, you mentioned COINTELPRO at FBI's involvement with Dr. King. Do you believe that if Dr. King would have been alive, we would have had a messianistic theory? I mean, we saw with COINTELPRO also Cleaver and the other member of the Panthers.
Bobby Seale?
Not Seale.
Huey Newton.
Yes, we saw that they ended up having an argument towards the end. So do you believe that we need in terms of having to organize and mobilize, how do we go about that now without having a messianistic person for trying to lead the Black and other, excuse me, I'm trying to get my narrative.
Yeah.
But how do we get that to achieve what amount of time?
There's two things that I think we need to do. One relates directly to your question, the other is something else. The thing that relates directly to your question is that we fight messiahism by building collective leaderships. We fight it by constantly introducing humility in the way we operate. And the other thing that we have to do is stop spreading rumors. You see, one of the things that was critical to COINTELPRO was rumor mongering. And rumor mongering, there was an actress, Jean Seberg, who basically went crazy. And part of what happened was, through COINTELPRO, it's documented, this is not just off, right? There were rumors that were being spread about her to destroy her life because she was a white woman, outspoken progressive. And one of the things that we do, every one of us, we admit it, let's just admit it, is that we love rumors. Oh, have you seen that woman that Reverend such and such is with? And you know, I saw Bill, he was getting out of the car. He's always going over to such and such's house. And so on and so forth, right? And one of the things when I was doing some organizing, I was working at a place where every time I'd show up, and this is union stuff, people would have these rumors. They said, Bill, we just heard blah, blah. So it was a Spanish-speaking place. I said, all right, the slogan we're going to introduce is no chisme. That is no gossip. I don't want to hear any more gossip. We're going to, if there's questions that people have, we track them down and we get to the facts. The level of gossip and rumor mongering that was used against our organizations was absolutely amazing. And so those two things, I think, will help us get ourselves together. And I think we're out of time. Thank you very much.
We've had suspense, we've had, everything was here. It was fantastic, and thank Councilmember Gossett and for the foresight to organize something like this. I feel like I've been to a symposium that's raised my consciousness, and that, of course, is the meaning of it all. It's all about meaning, and I got so much of it today, and I'm always so grateful. I feel like he's my comrade because we clearly came up in the same cultural era where we all became awakened and we can't go back to sleep. Overcoming, to overcome, you don't have to change something to overcome it. Do you hear that, what I'm trying to get at? You don't have to change the haters to overcome their resistance. You don't have to change them to overcome their obstacles they put in front of you. We can overcome without worrying about making them different and get to our goal of liberation, of dignity, of success, of accomplishment, of community, of prosperity, of intelligence, of education. As a community, we don't have to worry about how are they trying to stop us, or, there's been a lot of talk about what we should do about a lot of different things that Brother Fletcher talked about. What happened here today is what we have to do. Educate ourselves about the obscure people that the elite, power elite, have obscured. Bring them out and celebrate them. How do we celebrate our lost leaders? We talk about and celebrate them. This event is exactly what we should do. And we're doing it. That's overcoming, in my opinion. I can just only give you my opinion. If this continued worldwide, people would be, as they call today in the street, woke. People would be woke. And so that's where we want to go. That's where we're going. That's where we're headed. And for some of us, we're already there. So with that, I'm going to ask you to stand. And we are going to sing just 4 verses. We shall overcome. We are not afraid. Black, brown, white together. And we'll walk hand in hand. We shall overcome. Are we ready? We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Wait a minute. Now, see, I see Rose. Rose is doing it. I was going to ask people to do that. That some are holding hands. This is the way they used to walk. Remember when they used to march together? This is every like this here. We shall overcome. Oh, you started over. We shall overcome. Come on over here, Bill. We nice to see y'all like that. We shall overcome someday. We are not afraid. Come on. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. Smile when you sing it. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. Black, brown, white together. Black, brown, white together. Black, brown, white together. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe that we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We will walk hand in hand someday. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we'll walk hand in hand someday. We'll walk hand in hand someday. We'll overcome someday. We shall overcome one last time. We shall overcome. Come on. We shall overcome